But it's that time. Each and every Friday, we always love checking in with our guy, Dave Richards, CBS Sports Fantasy Football. Kind enough to join us this morning. Dave, you just got me. Carmichael Dave is overseas. I don't know what he's doing over there. I think he's still frustrated about who knows what. But, Dave, how are you today?
I'm doing good. And now that Dave's not around, can we just make it clear that the brains of the show is Jason Boss?
Oh, see, it's just... Every week.
I don't know if that was that good.
No, we'll take it. Because, look, you're on a streak, your own personal streak. And how are things going for you personally as far as your fantasy league? Look, you're giving advice all day. We're going to ask you about that. How are you doing in your leagues at the moment?
I'm glad you asked because it gives me a chance to bring up a point that I think fantasy managers should actually think about, not just this year, but moving forward. I've got like 1 or 2 teams that are 4-1, 1 and 2 teams that are 1-4. Thankfully, none that are 0-5.
Okay.
But I look at my standings in almost every single league, and it's like there's one team that's 4-1, one team that's 1-4, and then everybody else is 3-2 or 2-3. And it kind of gets me to thinking, like, you're either really unlucky or you had a really bad draft if you're worse than 2-3. And so I wonder if the point of drafting should now be trying to build a roster, because if everybody's going to be 2-3 and 3-2, you might as well try and build a roster so that it takes off by week 6 instead of weeks 1 through 4.
Right.
Because the managers that are 2-3 and maybe even 1-4, they might have had Jonathan Taylor, they might have had Cooper Kupp. They couldn't use those guys for the first 4 weeks of the season, and yet they still found their way to getting a couple of victories, maybe, hopefully.
Sure.
And so I almost wonder if that should be the strategy moving forward is let's draft guys who we're willing to be patient with, which is something that I've already been preaching, but it's patient with to the point that they can start to take off by the time we get to mid-October.
Yeah, and you know this too. We've actually had some significant injuries and a few more this last week, kind of on the heels of that, Dave. Is there anybody from, maybe some people that would have been played as fantasy guys that got injured, their backups, their fill-ins that you're kind of keeping your eye on that might be worth picking up?
So let's start in Minnesota with Justin Jefferson. The fact that we've lost him for at least 4 games and potentially longer, Jason, that makes me really, really nervous. KJ Osborne was the flavor of the week to pick up. And we've seen him succeed with Kirk Cousins before. He's played 20 games with Cousins. Each time he's had at least 5 targets in those 20 games, he's come through with at least 12 PPR points in 13 of those games. And a lot of them have come down to touchdowns. So that means that Kirk Cousins might look at him as somebody in the red zone, someone close to the goal line that he trusts. Osborne isn't a burner like he might have been in college at the University of Miami, that I might add. Yeah. Dave's not here to combat that. Yeah. But I think that he's someone who could end up being a decent volume, maybe a little too touchdown dependent. So that's one guy. I would go to Indianapolis for another, and this is a little roundabout, but we know that Anthony Richardson not playing for the next 4 games. That means Gardner Minshew. I don't think it means that the Colts are going to just run the ball and try not to throw. I think they trust Minshew as a passer, and I think this opens the door for Michael Pittman to have some good games. I think it opens the door for Josh Downs to have some good games as well. Somebody who could pick up maybe in the neighborhood of 6 catches a game, and that in PPR could lead to anywhere from 12 to 15 points. So I like the idea of grabbing him, maybe using him as a low-end number 3 wide receiver with the chance of him to break out to a number 2. Going in the different direction, Arizona lost James Conner. He's out for the next 4 games at least. Emari Demercado was a popular name to pick up off waivers. I know, say that 10 times fast. He's been their passing downs back all season long, Jason. And I could end up seeing him maybe in that same range as Downs, which isn't great for a fantasy running back, but as a bye week replacement, it'll do. You do have to keep your eye on whether or not Keontae Ingram will take work away from him. But those are the injuries. I mean, we can look at De'Von Achane in Miami. Yeah. I think Jeff Wilson will end up being the guy who replaces him, but you could see a little bit more of Savon Ahmed if Wilson isn't ready to go this week. That's a name to keep ready. And then in Chicago, Khalil Herbert doesn't look like he's going to play. Doesn't look like Roshan Johnson's going to play. This is maybe burying the lead, but Deontay Foreman could be the lead back for Chicago, and he'd be a decent number 2 running back even against Minnesota just based on volume alone.
Now that we've seen a larger sample size, not the whole season, but 5 weeks, guys like David Montgomery in Detroit. I mean, I don't know that I even thought much of him at all going into the season. Do we need to reevaluate those guys, sell high if you have them in a trade? Like, where are you on a guy like that who seemingly at this point is overachieved?
Yeah, he's playing at a very high level, and he's getting some really good opportunities. And it's really hard to call a running back like that a sell high.
Mm.
But if you get the opportunity to trade him and you just get a massive haul in return, let's say you can turn David Montgomery into Tony Pollard and maybe even something else, because the fantasy manager that's had Tony Pollard, they're frustrated with what they've gotten out of him for the majority of the season. I would say yes to something like that, but just because you call a player sell high doesn't mean you're trying to get him off your team for whatever you can get. You're not trading David Montgomery and turning him into Chris Olave and Dameon Pierce, for example. Those are two guys that have kind of underwhelmed this year, and they could have an opportunity to step up and have some big games. I like Pierce as a buy low, but I don't think it means that you just get rid of David Montgomery, and then you tack on the fact that it's hard to find good running backs that you can start without batting an eyelash. And I think that Montgomery is one of those guys right now that you're just going to continue to start. You're going to expect him to score. You're going to expect him to get 15 touches per game. What more can you ask for from a fantasy running back?
Dave Richard joining us, CBS Sports Fantasy Football. Got some from our listeners here. Let's see. Flex this week, Olave, Spears, or Jeff Wilson Jr.?
I'd go with Olave, and I know that he's been disappointing the last couple of weeks. 2 games ago, Derek Carr's arm looked terrible. He wasn't really challenging downfield. That changed last week. He did challenge downfield. There was an opportunity for Olave to catch a long touchdown. It looked like he had it. He did not have it. It was ruled incomplete. If he catches that ball, you're not even questioning whether or not to start Chris Olave. I like his matchup this week against Houston. I don't love it, but I think he's got too much upside to sit.
Another one from our text line, start Justin Fields or Kirk Cousins?
Well, Cousins just lost Justin Jefferson. And even though Cousins is taking on Chicago, I have a hard time expecting him to put up numbers like 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. And Justin Fields has gotten 4 touchdowns each of his past 2 games. I'm not a big believer in this Vikings defense. I know the numbers have looked good. I am kind of a believer in Justin Fields. I think he's actually thrown well the last 3 games. We've only seen the fantasy production spike in the last 2. I think he's worth chancing this week over Cousins.
Always like to ask you maybe to cover more teams or more people out there listening. Who is rated higher this week, whether that's matchup, injury, whatever, than maybe normal week? So who's kind of an outlier for you that's moved up this week?
I'm going to look at wide receivers for this because I don't think there's anybody at running back. I mentioned Michael Pittman as somebody who should get more opportunities now that it's Gardner Minshew under center. And I think we've actually reached a point with Jacoby Myers for the Raiders as someone who's become a must-start. You look at the games he's played with Jimmy Garoppolo, and he's been awesome, at least 15 PPR points in each of them. Zay Flowers is another name. Last week, 11 targets. You love to see it. Anytime the Ravens have a matchup where it looks like their run game might struggle, and this is one of those matchups against Tennessee, I believe in their run defense. I think Zay Flowers has a chance to see a lot of targets. So I'm starting him, for example, over Garrett Wilson and over Amari Cooper. Nico Collins, just going in the opposite direction. We've seen Nico Collins really become a boom or bust type of fantasy receiver. I don't like his matchup as much against the Saints. So I'm starting those guys that I mentioned, Pittman and Zay Flowers, and even Gabe Davis, all ahead of Nico Collins. At tight end, this is where I think we can get some players who maybe you're not sure about who to start and sit. I love where Cole Kmet is at in Chicago. He's their number 2 receiver. He's averaged 7 targets per game in his past 2. The Vikings defense, they're pretty good against tight ends, including Travis Kelce last week. But, Jason, I think that Cole Kmet can finish as a top 10 tight end and maybe even a top 7 tight end this week. So I'm starting him. I'm starting Logan Thomas. I expect both those guys to continue to see a lot of targets in their respective offenses to give them a chance to help fantasy managers.
Look, we spend most of our time on QBs, running backs, wide receivers, maybe tight ends, flex positions, and we're past the draft, so maybe this question doesn't fit as much for you, Dave, but where are you like with defenses, with kickers? Did you draft them, I don't know, earlier than some? Do you kind of stash a couple defenses and do it by matchups per week? Just philosophy-wise, where are you on kickers and defense?
So I basically treat them the same way, and I don't really want to pay too much mind to them, but you've got to start these positions in your league, assuming you are in an antiquated league that still uses kickers, and DSTs are pretty prevalent, Jason. You want to try and come up with a game plan for the next week or 2, especially now. Here's a public service announcement to everybody that's listening. There are 6 teams, 6, on bye next week. So when you go to set your lineup in week 6, go ahead and set it for week 7 too. And if you see too many holes in your lineup, plan ahead and it's going to be easier to plan ahead now than it will be on the waiver wire next Tuesday, and that includes DSTs. The Commanders, for example, they've got Atlanta this week. They've got the Giants after that. You've got a 2-week window with them to be a helpful DST, and that's better than somebody like Dallas, for example, who you might have drafted to be a stud DST unit. They weren't that last week. They play at the Chargers this week. I don't like that matchup for them. And then they're on bye in week number 7. You can make that swap. In fact, former NFL cornerback Bryant McFadden works with us here at CBS Sports HQ. And we laid out a plan together where he can oscillate between the Commanders and the Jets DSTs, and he'll have a matchup that he loves all the way through week 11.
Wow.
And so that's the type of forward thinking that I like to use when it comes to DSTs. It might take you 10 minutes of time out of your life to go and try and find a path to use one DST. It's up to you whether or not you want to carry 2 DSTs like Bryant is going to do on his fantasy teams. But that's part of the strategy this time of year. The DST that you drafted, you're not beholden to them at all, and you shouldn't have spent more than maybe one of your last 3 picks on them. Go ahead and do what you think is best for your DSTs moving forward, and that includes planning ahead, even if it's just 2 weeks ahead, to help you succeed in fantasy.
Let's be honest. That sounds like a spreadsheet that's more fun than any kind of work spreadsheets, right?
Sure. I mean, who wants to deal with TPS reports?
Exactly. Another one coming in here, Zay Flowers or Godwin, excuse me.
I think I'll lean toward Godwin if there's no Mike Evans. We know that Evans had a hard time coming out of the bye with his hamstring, but he was limited in practice on Thursday. I would guess that we will learn more about Evans having a chance to play on Friday. And with that being the case, Evans will probably play. And I would say that Godwin won't be as good as Flowers if that's the case.
I always like to ask you about the 49ers just in general, the way the offense is going. I mean, it seems like you play everybody with this team. Cleveland's defense has been good, but so had the Cowboys. The Niners lit them up. How many Niners would you play this week?
I'd play a lot of them. I love what I've seen for Brock Purdy, and he's been so consistent for fantasy managers. All but one of his regular season starts has resulted in at least 20 fantasy points. And it really should have been 100% of them. He had a game earlier this year. He threw a pass that was ruled a lateral. It went for a touchdown. It should have counted. I'm bitter. But I think Brock Purdy has earned it to be a must-start fantasy quarterback. And yes, the Browns' defense is tough. They've got a great pass rush. And you said it. They did great against the Cowboys. Purdy didn't just play well. He played great. He's a phenomenal fit for that offense. He's elevating that offense. So he's much more than just a game manager. He deserves his props. Kyle Shanahan does too. This offense is exciting. I would expect Brandon Ayuk to have a big day against that man coverage that the Browns tend to play. And I think that the protection will be there for Brock Purdy to help him throw at least 2 touchdowns and maybe 250 yards, but there's potential for 3. They've got the playmakers to do it.
How can everybody check out all your great work that you're doing on a day-to-day and week-to-week basis?
Go on YouTube. Do me a favor. If you're listening and you want some fantasy advice that'll help you, join me and all my buddies on Fantasy Football Today. We've got live streams every day. We just finished one this morning. We do it every morning before you even wake up out there in California. It'll be ready for you to watch while you brush your teeth, have breakfast, listen to on your way to work. It's called Fantasy Football Today. Search for it on YouTube. It's by CBS Sports. Like and subscribe and help dominate your fantasy leagues.
Dave, I got to ask before we go, what swear words did you invent last Saturday with the conclusion of that Miami game?
See, I was hoping not to even address this because Dave wasn't on. I would expect Dave to zing me on this, but not you, Jason. The words were they were mortifying coming out of my mouth. I was shaking with anger over what was going on because the Canes season came to basically a flashpoint this week, and I'm very nervous that they're not going to be competitive against North Carolina.
That's a big
game. We don't have
to
talk about that. We can talk about the NFL and fantasy football moving forward.
Well, the great thing
is focus on that.
Yeah, the great thing is our listeners know you. They love you. They're like, you got to ask them about the Canes. Got to ask them about the Canes. So they know you. They know the reputation. And everybody's ready to pounce. But hey, maybe you guys bounce back against North Carolina.
The only thing I want to see now is an upset victory over Florida State. And I still believe they can do that. But I can't imagine what Dave would have said to me if they did this against FSU. Oh, Jason, he'd be insufferable.
I know.
I don't know if I'd be able to come back on the show ever.
I know.
Ever. Well, if Cristobal had called that against Florida State.
I know. Well, hopefully that was the worst moment of your season. We wish your Canes the best of luck, your fantasy teams the best of luck, all those getting advice from you. We thank you, and we do look forward to talking to you again next week.
I look forward to talking to you, Jason. Thank you so much for having me. Good luck in your fantasy leagues.
All right, thank you so much. That is Dave Richard, always doing great work. And yeah, that was a brutal loss for the Canes last week. You guys were on it. A lot of people, you got to ask him. Yeah, we got in there with that one for sure. All right, when we take the break, we'll take a break. We'll come back.